What, in a nutshell, is the case for colonialism, and why does it matter that people, beyond the academic controversies, like, why does this subject matter?
So the easiest way to think about the case for colonialism is it's a bit like saying the case for oxygen in the atmosphere. Like, do you really think we'd be here if there were no oxygen in the atmosphere? Colonialism wasn't a bunch of people in pith hats jumping into a ship with guns and say, let's go repress and conquer black people, right? Colonialism was part of a huge structural transformation of the world that began with the rise of Europe and the separation of European development from the rest, right? The Great Divergence, it's called in economic history, when the Europe just took off politically, economically, socially, organizationally, militarily, technologically, right? Suddenly this huge gap emerged between Europe and the rest. Now, when is that? Post-Renaissance, right? So 17th, 1600s, basically, early 1600s. I mean, Britain's first colonies are like Bermuda, 1603, right? This is the first time the Spanish and the Portuguese. And then this accelerates all the way through the 19th century into the early 20th century. So Europe was spreading out whether you liked it or not.
Right.
Okay, so this is the first thing to remember. People assume there's some kind of voluntarism all the time, right? That they decided and they sat down and said, let's go colonize the world. Never happened, right? Europe spread out because it had things to trade. It had guns, it had shipping technology, it had missionaries, it had explorers, it had scientists. It had people who were interested in establishing understanding of foreign cultures. All this was going to happen no matter whether governments were part of it or not, right? Europe was coming for the world. It was going to engage the world. So that's the first thing to remember, okay? What we call the push factors were not governments like planning colonial expeditions. Right. It was simply this massively advanced civilization expanding around the world. The second part, on the demand side, almost always these people were welcomed. The relationships were friendly. Why? Because the Europeans offered things that were useful. They brought food, they brought metal, they brought technology. They often brought protection from a local rival. I mean, the way that Nigeria became a British colony is basically that the king of Lagos had been chased off his throne by internal rivals. And he asked the British to come on shore and put him back on his seat. And his local ally said, yes, please come. And for God's sake, colonize us, because otherwise we're going to be swamped and degraded and enslaved by this group that's slightly to the north of us. And that's the common pattern of how European colonialism was established, we call these the pull factors, right? Local populations almost always welcomed, collaborated with, cooperated with, or at least accommodated the European expansion, right? So the idea of force and resistance is nonsense. It's not a historically accurate picture of how Europe came to occupy through colonial control, depending on how you look at it, 2/3 or 3/4 of the globe, right? So in part, there's no case to be made other than it's like the case for volcanoes or something. Like we don't decide whether or not there are volcanoes in the world. There just are. Colonialism was of that sort. It just was going to happen. It's a classic example of civilizational rise and expansion that's happened throughout human history.